Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another CARS Reading Skills Workshop as part of your Jack Westin MCAT Podcast. As always, you're joined by your hosts, Usher and Molly. In this episode, we're going to be going through one of our Jack Westin CARS daily passages called Quitting Smoking. This is the passage from February 25th. Now, if you're new to our CARS Reading Skills Workshop, really our goal here is to help you identify what the key arguments are from this passage and where they're mentioned, as well as how you can track these arguments as you make your way through the passage so that you can identify the passage main idea in a nice, streamlined, time-efficient manner and have essentially a physical map that has all of the key arguments that you can use for the questions. So if you have never been with us for a CARS Reading Skills Workshop, we always recommend to take a look at the passage ahead of time if you have the time or the interest in doing so. It is the daily passage, again, from February 25th. So if you're listening to this on the 25th, you can navigate to our website, jackwestin.com, and it'll be the daily CARS passage from that day. You could also grab the link from the description if you prefer. You can grab that anytime. Awesome. Well, Usher, I'm excited to go through this passage. I feel like this one is one that a lot of individuals, right, that might be listening to this might connect with. It's a fun read. I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah. Especially in med school, you'll learn all about this. We talk about some pretty like science related, medical school and chemical related stuff too, which is pretty cool. And yeah, it's a fun read. I think it's something that, we've all kind of, I guess, seen in some way, shape, or form. So,
Yeah.
all right, well, I'll go ahead and get started then. So, paragraph one, never underestimate the power of your enemy. Okay, so don't underestimate my enemy. I don't really know. Right now, I'm kind of wondering like who is my enemy? I don't know who they're talking about, and I'm hoping they're gonna tell me who they're talking about, who my enemy is in the next part here. Although nicotine may not give the taste of nirvana that more notorious drugs do, its effects on the nervous system are profound and hard to resist. Okay, so I think my enemy here is nicotine, which sounds like something that can be daunting. And it says nicotine may not give the taste of nirvana. So I'm assuming this is saying, well, nicotine doesn't really give you that euphoric sort of feeling, like super euphoric feeling that more notorious drugs do. But here's something that's super important that the passage is trying to tell me, right? We kind of set up this like counter argument a little bit. Like, yeah, it doesn't give you like a huge euphoric feeling, but its effects on the nervous system are profound and hard to resist. So that's definitely a strong argument, right, that we're seeing. So I'm keeping that in mind as I'm moving forward. It increases levels of acetylcholine and norepinephrine, brain chemicals that regulate mood, attention, and memory. Okay, so here I'm kind of delving into the detail, I guess, behind how it really affects the nervous system, right? We're altering chemicals and compounds that regulate our mood, attention, and memory. It also appears to stimulate the release of dopamine in the reward center of the brain, as opiates, cocaine, and alcohol do. So, still getting into that, sort of chemical pathway it activates and how it affects, the nervous system. It also releases dopamine and activates our reward pathway, just like here are some of those notorious drugs, like right, like opiates, cocaine, and then alcohol. So I think here, the big argument I'm kind of seeing in this paragraph is that nicotine affects the nervous system in a strong way, in a profound way. So here I'd probably write P1, nicotine, AFFXS, affects in a shorter way, nervous system, right? Or just it affects NS strongly, something around along those lines. Because I feel like that's really the picture they're trying to paint in this paragraph. What did you think, Molly?
Yeah, this paragraph is super fun. I mean, especially as individuals, right? Us pre-meds, most of us are pretty interested in biology and biochemistry. And when we see what's going on in this paragraph, we're going to see a lot of things that feel reminiscent of biochem and psych soc. It's like, wait a minute, why are we talking about neurotransmitters and all of these things? This is a CARS passage. keep in mind your scope. Okay, when you're in a CARS passage, you are not a biochemist, you're not a, neurobiologist. Keep focused, which you did a great job doing. Where are the arguments? Right? Don't start drawing, nicotine binds to opioid receptors or whatever, right? Like no, don't pull it back. We want to focus on what the actual arguments are, which is exactly what you said, right? It's the effect on the nervous system. Nothing specific, but that is what is being brought up in this paragraph. I also think that first sentence is a really interesting one to start with, right? You may know the name of the passage. We mentioned it. It's quitting smoking. But in some CARS passages, you won't, right? When you're taking your real test, you can, in theory, look down at the title. I don't always do that. I don't really recommend doing it because sometimes the title has nothing to do with the topic. Here, just because it's funny, the title of this actual entry is called Kicking Butts. So it's actually a pretty clever play on words for quitting smoking. But obviously, if you read Kicking Butts, you might not know what you're reading. That being said, when you start this, never underestimate the power of your enemy. What does that mean? Right? It's a very catchy hook, but I don't know how to interpret that, right? You did a great job of like, okay, who's my enemy? Do I have enemies? Sure, I saw your life flash before your eyes. Like, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to have enemies.
No, no, I have no enemies. I have no enemies.
Yes, I would be shocked if you had a single enemy, Usher. But again, you read that and you're like, okay, what are you talking about? Right? Like that's an argument, it's a point, but that I don't think that's really what the ultimate goal is to communicate, right? And it led us right into our discussion of nicotine and its effect on the nervous system. Again, it's enough to draw you in, but it itself is not something we necessarily need to map. Okay, it's more just meant to get your attention for the rest of the arguments. So I think you did that perfectly. Nicotine, has strong effects on the NS, right? Or nicotine arrow NS with a little star, right? However you want to visualize that. I think that's perfect.
Thank you, Molly. All right. Well, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into our second paragraph. Addiction research has clearly established that drugs with a rapid onset that hit the brain quickly have the most potent psychological impact and are the most addictive. Okay, here we've got sort of new argument that we're kind of trying to establish here, right? Drugs that hit the brain quick, these are the ones that are very potent and end up being the most addictive. They have a very potent psychological impact, right? So I'm seeing here that drugs that have a rapid onset lead to strong effects. With cigarettes, the smoker gets virtually immediate onset, says Jack Henningfield, PhD, Chief of Clinical Pharmacology Research for the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I almost said Jack Westin right there, okay? But anyway, it says with cigarettes, the smoker gets virtually immediate onset, right? So here we're seeing that very similar. We're kind of establishing a link between what we saw in the first sentence. Okay, drugs that hit the brain quick have very high addiction potential. And now we're saying cigarettes, you get pretty much immediate onset, right? So we're now linking, well, this idea that cigarettes have high addiction potential and high potency. The cigarette is the crack cocaine of nicotine delivery. All right, that's a very strong statement, right? I mean, it's a statement that's kind of just going with what we're saying here, but this guy Jack Henningfield is saying, hey, cigarette, nicotine delivery, that's crack cocaine, okay, in this world. The cigarette also gives the smoker something remarkable, the ability to get precise fingertip dose control, says Henningfield. Okay, I think this might mean, I guess, because you can like control how much you are putting into your body, right? Like I guess the puffs that you take. I'm not 100% sure on. I think that's the reason why, but I'm not 100% sure. I think the big thing for this paragraph, now that we're at the end of it, and what I would want to track is, the link that we have there between smoking and the onset, and then what fast onset drugs do, right? So If we have rapid onset, that's high addiction, right? They have the most addiction potential. And then cigarettes have that. So I'd probably say like P2, um, rapid onset, arrow, addiction, and then, you know, um, put a cigarette or something and have it be next to that sentence to sort of illustrate that, right? Because this paragraph is essentially saying, well, cigarettes are the ones that also have a rapid onset. And I probably also want to mention Henningfield, throw Henningfield in there, or put like JH, his initials, because he's the one that's coming in to support this idea. What did you think about this, Mon?
I love the idea of drawing a cigarette. I feel like we talk so much in our courses, in our free sessions, in our, video solutions on like having a very brief, often abbreviated or symbolic map can help a lot, right? Use arrows, use equal signs, use, does not equal signs, symbols, things like that. Keep it short and sweet when you make a written map. But I love the idea of also including drawings. I feel like I've never done that before, but you know what? This would be a great opportunity. A cigarette is basically just a stick with smoke coming out of it. I feel like I have pretty limited drawing abilities, but that I might be able to do. So I love that. And I feel like this paragraph in particular, if we really are just looking what is a fact versus what is an argument, objectively, most of these sentences have arguments in them. And the question becomes, are they all different? Are they all important to track? And I think you've done a really great job of summarizing how multiple related arguments can fit together and to be, represented in still a very brief way, right? So we started with the idea that just drugs have a rapid onset. Those are the ones that are the most addictive because of that impact. And then we take it specifically to cigarettes, right? With Henningfield, this virtually immediate onset. Now we've gone from drugs in general to specifically cigarettes, and we're tying a new person in. That's important. We made it even more extreme, talking about crack cocaine. And then we talk about this dose control. And technically, it feels like that's an argument, but I agree with you. I'm not exactly sure where we're going with that. I kind of understand that they have the ability to control the dose, but I'm not sure if that's going to be something that we expand on quite or a lot in the passage. I think it's fair
Yeah,
to hold off on it for now, and if it comes up again, great. We'll recognize it, we'll get it in our map, but I think it kind of goes pretty well hand in hand with the idea that cigarettes have this rapid onset and that they're incredibly addictive, right? This
yeah,
this dose control and that ability that's remarkable maybe is just helping explain how it is addictive. So I think you're right to hold off on that. Totally fair to do until you get a little more context. As long as you've got the idea of drugs and specifically cigarettes with a rapid onset being most or being particularly addictive. And as long as you have Henningfield, I think you're good for this paragraph.
absolutely. Thank you, Molly. And yeah, I'm not like a creative, like I'm like probably the least artistic person you will ever meet in your life. Like my wife is so artistic, and I'm just the exact like absolute opposite. But I can draw stick figures and I think a little cigarette. So yeah, it makes it a little fun, right? All right. Paragraph 3. The impetus to smoke is indeed, as the tobacco companies put it, for pleasure. Okay, so here we're kind of seeing that the reason um, for smoking is pleasure, right? It's for pleasure. But there's no evidence that smoke in the mouth provides much pleasure, says Henningfield. All right, so we smoke for pleasure, but there's no actual evidence that like when smoke is in your mouth that you're getting pleasure from that, right? This is what Henningfield is saying. We do know that nicotine in the brain does. Okay, so here's like the sort of distinction, right? When people are smoking cigarettes, they're the nicotine itself, that's what's actually providing the pleasure, right? Like if I just smoked, I don't know, a cigarette with zero nicotine, I may not actually have pleasure, but it's the nicotine that's actually providing the pleasure. The smoke is just like a means to an end. So this is probably something I'd want to track, right? I'd probably just put P3, um, nicotine, arrow, pleasure, and then I'd put like not smoke or X smoke. And then I'd want to put down JH or Henningfield again, because this is again him saying this and him providing this idea. Um, what do you think? Anything you wanted to add here, Molly?
No, I think that's pretty much it, right? It's a super short little paragraph. And again, I think what's important to recognize is we're now talking about the reason to smoke, right? Like you're smoking for pleasure. It's not just talking about the impact of the nicotine on the brain or why it's addictive. It's why do you start, right? Um,
Right.
which is this idea of it being pleasurable. And it's interesting that we're clarifying like about it is even pleasurable. But again, I think as long as you're tracking the basics of this, I think you're pretty much good. We're still talking about Henningfield, short and sweet. I think keep our map pretty simple for this one.
Absolutely. Okay. So, paragraph 4. For many, however, nicotine not only gives pleasure, it eases pain. All right. So, here, we're kind of adding on something new. All right. It's not just about pleasure, but it's also about helping with your pain, right? Easing, giving you some kind of relief or making you feel good. Evidence has mounted that a substantial number of smokers use cigarettes to regulate emotional states, particularly to reduce negative affect like anxiety, sadness, or boredom. All right, so here we get even more of a clarification of that idea, right? So we said first it eases pain, and we're getting into a little bit more detail now. We're saying, well, people are using cigarettes to regulate their emotional states, right? And specifically, it's to reduce like kind of when they're in a negative emotional state, right? Like if they're anxious, if they're sad, if they're bored, right? And so here, this is something I want to keep in mind, right? We're using cigarettes to reduce negative affect or reduce negative feeling, reduce negative emotion. Okay, next sentence. People expect that having a cigarette will reduce bad feelings. Cool. That's actually kind of like it's very similar to what we just said, right? Says Thomas Brandon, PhD, assistant professor of psychology at SUNY Binghamton. All right, so this guy is being brought in to kind of provide support for the idea we're talking about. So people are smoking, they're using nicotine through having a cigarette to hopefully reduce their bad feelings. That's what they're hoping for, right? They're expecting that. His research found this, in fact, to be one of the principal motivations for daily smokers. All right, so he actually did research on this, and then he found this is one of the main reasons people are driven to smoke, right? People are driven to smoke to reduce their negative emotion, to regulate their negative emotional state. So I think we've kind of been repeating that idea throughout here. So that's what I definitely want to track for this paragraph. I'd want to say something like, okay, P4, um, people smoke to, and then I put like a down arrow, negative. I put like neg emotion or neg state. Okay. And then I'd also put Brandon. And then I might also put like next to that, I'd put like a number one. Okay. They didn't say here it's the number one reason. They said it's one of the principal motivations, but I think the number one would help me remember. Okay. It's one of the top reasons for why people actually smoke. Anything you wanted to add here, Molly?
I think that makes sense. Especially because in the last paragraph, we were talking about pleasure being a motivator, right? A reason why someone might be smoking. And in this paragraph, I feel like right straight from sentence one, we talk about how it doesn't just give pleasure, right? It eases pain. And we learned very quickly that this is psychological pain, right? So I feel like this is a pretty classic setup to a Cars passage. The beginning paragraphs seemed like they were giving us context, right? We talked about the effect of nicotine on the brain, right? On a biochemical sense. We talked about addiction and the fact that this is very addictive. And now we're getting into why. We've kind of been on this track of why do we smoke now for two paragraphs, right? It's interesting. I'm excited to see this passage continue to develop. We're about halfway through. Are we going to continue to focus on why? Are we going to talk about how nicotine is going to be, how it can impact individuals' lives, right? Like how how is this going to continue to develop? Okay, we're definitely on a track of getting into why individuals smoke. And you're right. The fact that this is stating that this is a principal motivator for daily smokers, that's important, right? It's important to put that in your map, especially given the framing of the first sentence. It's not just pleasure. This idea of easing pain seems to be really important. Yeah, putting in number one is great. I always use a star to indicate this is important. That's my favorite go-to symbol. But again, one little reminder for those of us listening, if you did this passage, if you mapped this passage and maybe you phrased your map a little differently than how we do ours, that's okay, right? The big thing that I want you guys to be thinking about while you're listening is when I read this, if you read it ahead of time, did this sentence or this idea, did it jump out to me? Like, did I clock it as an argument? Or when I read it, was I zoned out or was I confused based on the phrasing or did it feel like a fact to me? Okay, that's what's important while you're listening to think of if you really want to figure out, again, how to improve from this. So halfway in, let's see where
Okay.
where this passage takes us.
Yeah, let's get it. All right. So next paragraph. Negative affect runs the gamut from the transitory downtimes we all have several times a day to clinical depression. I'm not gonna lie, I have no clue what gamut means. I've never even heard of that. I don't think I've ever seen that word ever used, but I see that it says that it runs from the transitory downtimes we all have several times a day to clinical depression. So I think here they're kind of trying to define what negative affect is, right? It's like when you're just down, right? Like your down times, like everyone kind of has, everyone's kind of sad here and there, all the way to depression. So negative affect is like this big range, right? Of just just feeling down to actual clinical depression. Smokers are about twice as likely to be depressed as non-smokers, and people with a history of major depression are nearly 50% more likely than others to also have a history of smoking, according to Brandon. Okay, so we're talking about Brandon again. And so, what are we kind of really seeing here? Well, we're kind of defining negative affect. And then in this sentence, we're saying, well, people that smoke, they're likely to be, they're twice as likely to be depressed, right? So they have a much higher chance of being depressed, and people that have been depressed in the past are much more likely to also be smokers, right? Or to have a history of smoking. So here, I think what we're really trying to illustrate by like painting those two ideas is kind of like the same thing that we saw in this paragraph before, right? That essentially, we're giving more reasons as to why we're giving more of an example as to why people smoke, right? The reason why people smoke is to reduce, that negative affect, right? To help with their negative feeling. At the same time, like you might feel that you want to write down something a little extra here, just because I guess they're kind of talking like statistically a little bit. Well, and they're kind of getting into this concept of depression, right? So I don't think it would hurt to jot something down about that. For me, I'd probably just put here P5. Is this P5 or one, two,
Yeah.
three, four, five? Yeah, P5. I probably put P5, P4, and then Brandon again. And that's another point, right? Molly, if you had anything to say about that, I feel like we're writing down so many names on this passage. But what did you think of this paragraph and all of that?
Yeah, a lot of students will ask, do names matter? And the answer is yes, they do matter. They do. More specifically, though, it's not you need to memorize the entire quote. It's not that you need to go back to the passage whenever you get a question about a person. The most important thing to do when you see a person whose perspective is being shared, especially when it is consequential for the arguments introduced, is just to tie the person's name to the argument that they were associated with. Okay, so yeah, if I've got all the time in the world and I'm feeling like, nice and just lax, I might write the full last name out. Sometimes if I'm a little bit more stressed or if I'm a little pressed for time, I actually just write the last initial or the individual's initial. So like just H or Han or here for Brandon, like Bran. Keep it really, really short and sweet. If you ever had, let's say, Brandon, I don't know what another name is that starts with Brand. If you had a Brandon and like a Brendan or something like that, that sounded the same, maybe you write out the full second one, but the important thing is you have at least a portion of this individual's name, something to tie them to a particular argument in your map. So that if you get a question, hey, what did Brandon believe? You just look down and say, oh, Brandon is tied with this idea that people smoke because of this sort of emotional or psychological pain they're experiencing, right? It helps them deal with that, helps them reduce that pain. And I agree with you. In this paragraph, paragraph 5, we're still talking about Brandon's ideas. We're still building on paragraph 4. I think an arrow is definitely appropriate, but it's not just that you smoke because you're depressed. We're really just tying these two together. Like they're just incredibly correlated. It's a strong
Hmm.
correlation. Um, if you are a smoker, you probably were depressed and vice versa, right? There's just a strong tie between these. Um, I think it moves beyond a possible reason and it's taking it to reality of like this is a real correlation, a real connection that we see in data as you were talking about. So I agree. I
Yeah.
think adding a little bit of extra in addition to that arrow, I think it fits, right? In my eyes, I'm just thinking smoking and depression are tied, right?
Yeah.
Um, I would probably do smoking and then like a double-headed arrow and then depression. Like to me,
That's like literally exactly what I was thinking in my head. That's crazy.
oh my gosh, we're on the
Yeah.
same wavelength. No surprise.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Molly. Appreciate your thoughts there. And let's get into this next paragraph, paragraph 6, right? So, sadly, but not surprisingly, depression appears to cut your chance of quitting by as much as one half. And the same apparently applies to a lesser extent to people who just have symptoms of depression. Okay, so this is basically saying, depression will cut your chance of quitting by as much as one half. So they're basically saying depression makes it much harder to quit smoking, right? And then says, and to a lesser extent, to people who just have symptoms of depression, the same applies, right? So even if you have like, I guess, a milder form of depression, like just have symptoms of I mean, I feel like if you have symptoms of depression, you have depression. But anyway, I think it's trying to say here, if you have like a milder version of depression, it it will still cut your chances of quitting. So having depression makes it more difficult to quit smoking. Okay, according to Alexander Glassman, um, who is a professor of psychiatry at Columbia Med, University College of Physicians and Surgeons, the act of quitting can trigger severe depression in some people. Oh, okay. So this is something, um, pretty strong, right? It's not just that if you're depressed, your chance of quitting decreases, but if you if you are a smoker and then you try to quit, that can actually cause severe depression. In one study, the 9 smokers in a group of 300 in a cessation program became more depressed. 2 were so frankly suicidal that the researchers advised them to give up the effort and try again later. Dang, that's actually, um, really, sad, right? So we had people that were in a group of 300 that are trying to quit smoking, and the study showed that some of these people that tried to quit smoking, they became more depressed and even suicidal to the point where they were like, hey, just don't try again later, right? Like come back to it. All but one had a history of major depression. So um, pretty much all of them, were depressed in the past in some way, shape, or form. So there's some very important ideas in this paragraph here, right? First off, we have another name, okay, like we've been seeing in every paragraph. So I don't want to write down this guy AG down. But I think the big thing here is that if I probably track like, okay, P6, depression will, an arrow, and then I probably put like hard to quits, okay? And then with the word quit, right, you could also, draw an arrow from there and say quitting, an arrow off of that and put like can cause depression or leads to depression. So an arrow that says depression. kind of a tough thing to track because there's like multiple ideas, but it's kind of all in one sort of circle in a way. So I'd want to
Yeah.
track those and then sort of put AG. What do you think, Molly?
Yeah, I mean, this paragraph, quitting smoking is never a lighthearted topic, right? We knew that that was the paragraph, or that was the name of the passage. This paragraph gets really pretty dark, right? And it's related to what we had talked about previously when we were just tying smoking and depression. But this is not just you're more likely to smoke if you're depressed and vice versa. This is now talking about quitting, right? So it's related to what we had talked about. I feel like it's definitely we're on that same track. We haven't really had a full U-turn in our passage argument or anything like that. But this paragraph adds something unique, which is this element of quitting, right? And it's almost like quitting, trying to quit smoking leads to, or being depressed makes quitting harder, which then augments the depression, right? Which makes quitting further, more and more difficult. It's this vicious cycle. And actually, when I mapped this paragraph, I drew it as a cycle. So I put depression, arrow, quitting harder. And then I actually just put an arrow that wrapped right back around to depression, from quitting harder back to depression, which makes quitting
Ah,
harder than that, and then back to more depression. And it's this for me, that visual helped me just picture this is a vicious cycle that, if it continues, can have really dangerous effects, right? Because it's basically saying, again, being depressed makes quitting harder, and if you can't quit, or when you try and quit, it makes depression worse. So it's just a very, very tough situation. I do think we're still talking about, this tie between smoking and depression, or easing sort of emotional pain. It's worth it. I think that was originally introduced in paragraph 4. We kind of touched on it again in 5. We're touching it on again in 6. But I definitely think that we need to talk specifically about quitting in this paragraph, because that's the new layer to this argument. That being said, we
yeah.
have 2 more paragraphs. It feels though that we've got a pretty good idea of our main idea, at least for now. We could go off in a totally new direction, but we've now been 3 paragraphs in a row pretty focused on the reason why people smoke and why people
Yeah.
struggle to quit smoking. And it's all had this kind of common theme of smoking and depression being tied together. So it's important whenever you start to feel like you've found your rhythm and you're like, oh, okay, I bet the next paragraph's going to be similar. Um, it's important to think about, especially if you're someone who struggles to find the main idea at the end of the passage. See if you can guess what's going to be important as you're reading. Um, Always pause and reflect, but it might help you engage a little bit more to be reflecting on it as you read.
Thank you, Molly. All right. So let's get into paragraph 7. These weren't average smokers, Glassman points out. Okay, so still talking about Glassman and sort of his example, right? So these weren't just your regular smokers. I'm not really sure what that means. I guess maybe he might be trying to say that they smoke a lot or they smoke a little. I'm not too sure, right? All were heavily dependent. Okay, so all were heavily dependent on nicotine. They smoked at least a pack and a half daily, had their first cigarette within a half hour of awakening, and had tried to quit on average 5 times before. Okay, so that's what he means by these weren't average smokers, right? He's basically saying that they smoked a lot, right? They were smoking very often. They tried to quit multiple times and couldn't, right? They were very dependent on nicotine. So this is, we're seeing that they were heavily dependent on nicotine, right? It is possible, he suggests, that nicotine has an antidepressant effect on some. Oh, wow. Okay. So I think, here, I mean, now Glassman is saying, well, it has an antidepressant effect. Well, this kind of is reminding me of an idea that I've been seeing throughout the passage, right? Which is that people are smoking to basically regulate their negative emotions, right? Or to regulate their emotional state. Like what we saw in paragraph 4, I believe it was, and paragraph 5. We're kind of seeing that people are smoking to kind of reduce that psychological pain, provide relief for their states. So this kind of, I mean, it says it differently, right? It's saying nicotine has an antidepressant effect, but I think we're still kind of hitting at that same idea. Did you feel that same way, Molly, or do you feel like this is something new?
No, I definitely feel like it's the same direction. Again, it's the same person. This is still Glassman that we're talking about. It almost feels like paragraph, what is it, 6 and 7 could have just been one paragraph. But the
Hmm.
author is choosing to split them up. And I hear this often from students, like, does it matter? Right? I actually just had a student yesterday in office hours that was asking me, what do I do when a passage has like 7, 8, or even more paragraphs? Like it takes me forever to read. And one of the things that I was telling them is, well, when you have more and more paragraphs, the author is intentionally splitting ideas that are actually probably connected, right? Like just because there's more paragraphs doesn't mean that there are more ideas that you need to track. Sometimes in a situation like this, the last two paragraphs we've read ultimately could have been one. They have chosen, though, to separate it. And it's important to honor that decision that was made by the author because that actually can tell you a lot about their perspective, right? The author is choosing to do this. And I always think to myself, why? Right? They're not two separate ideas, really, that you're trying to separate. So why take a long paragraph and split it into two? Right? It's for readability. They're trying to make sure that you understand this. They might have known that if they gave it to you in a really long run-on paragraph, it might not have been as convincing, right? They're trying to make it really clear, probably because this is an argument they care a lot about. So I totally agree. I think we're seeing the same thing come up, especially in that last sentence. Nicotine has an antidepressant effect on some. It's pretty much exactly what we had said earlier with the previous paragraph of like, this, smoking and nicotine, which is present within cigarette smoke, has this pain alleviating effect, especially with negative emotions, right? Which is why we're talking about depression. So completely agree. This one to me is just an arrow plus Glassman. I don't think anything that we added in this paragraph is important enough to put like a plus and something else. At least in my eyes, I put an arrow
Yeah,
and I put Glassman and call it a day.
yeah, I'd agree with you. Okay, well, let's go ahead and finish off with our last paragraph here. So it says, for a person who often feels sad, anxious, or bored, smoking can easily become a dependable coping mechanism to be given up only with great difficulty. Okay, so it says smoking can easily become a dependable coping mechanism, right? And so it's basically saying when someone, for anyone that's kind of having some negative emotional state, you can easily go to smoking as like how you cope, right? But that's going to be very, very difficult to quit, right? It's going to be very difficult to stop. In fact, negative affect is what precipitates relapse among would-be quitters 70% of the time, according to Saul Schiffman, PhD professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. Okay, so we start off by saying, when someone is feeling negative, right? They can shift to smoking. I think that that's kind of in line with what we've been seeing in the passage, right? That people expect to have their negative emotional states, regulated with smoking, right? And now we're also saying, well, negative affect is what actually causes also relapse, right? So people that go and quit smoking, right? When they have some kind of negative emotional state, that is what causes them to actually start smoking again 70% of the time. And we haven't talked about relapse yet, so I'm kind of paying pretty close attention to this. I know that we did repeat the idea that we've been repeating in that first sentence, but for me, this is kind of something that we've talked about how it's difficult to quit, but we haven't talked about relapse much in my eyes. So I'm kind of keeping this in mind. We invited people to call a relapse prevention hotline to find out what moments of crises were like. Okay. What was striking was how often they were in the grip of negative emotions just before relapses, strong temptations, and close calls. Okay, so here it's like they did this sort of like little study where they're having people call before they're about to relapse to figure out like what is it like for you? Like what are you going through before? How are you feeling before you're about to relapse? And what they found was that these people were in, very negative emotional states, right? just before they would have a relapse, or even when they would have like temptation to smoke, and even when they would have like close call. I guess close calls is like just before relapse, but like temptation, that's all caused by negative emotions. So negative emotions are kind of driving them to relapse almost. A more precise study using palm top computers to track the state of mind of participants is getting similar results, Schiffman says. Okay, so we're repeating that same idea, and now we're saying with a new study. I don't really know much about the study. I don't like a palm top. I don't know if you know what a palm top computer is, Molly.
Nope.
I, I have no clue what that is.
I
I've
have
never heard of
no
that in my
idea.
life. That is like okay. Anyway, but for me, I felt like well, this paragraph we repeated the same idea we've been repeating again in that first sentence. But I also feel like we're, I don't know. I think we're introducing something new. I could be wrong just with this whole thing about relapse. Um, so I would probably, if it was me, I'd probably put here like, P8, I think it is. P8, yeah. So um, I put P8, P4, right? Or P8 arrow to P4. And then I probably also put um, negative, like a negative symbol, and then put arrow, relapse, and then put SS or Schiffman next to it. What do you think about that? And what are you thinking for, I guess, our final idea here?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's kind of almost a parallel to what we had said with the quitting paragraph, which I think was paragraph 6. Um, which again kind of spilled into paragraph 7. It's it's still the same tie between depression or negative emotions and smoking. We've made it in P4, P5, P6, P7, and now P8. It's again and again and again. As far as main idea goes, I think that's it. Right? That being said, one of the things that we talk about in our courses is, when you find an idea that's repeated, especially in this case through more than half of the text of the passage, it all comes back to the same idea. The danger is we don't want to lose context, okay? Because 4 out of 8 of these paragraphs, we're essentially saying the exact same thing, which is there's a tie between negative emotions and depression with smoking again and
Hmm.
again and again. That being said, each paragraph is giving us a slightly different perspective on it. Not even a different perspective, but a separate, you know, lens to look at this through, right? Again, we got quitting, we got relapse, right? These are things that can easily just be lost. So I would say, just as a general piece of advice from this passage, is if you were thinking to yourself, paragraph 4, I mapped it. Paragraph 5, arrow to P4. Paragraph 6, arrow to P4. Paragraph 7, arrow to P4. Paragraph 8, same thing, just an arrow. I want to encourage you, if you start to realize I've got multiple arrows from the same paragraph and nothing else added, ask yourself, is it a literal carbon copy of that? Is there a word or a phrase that you could add that would remind you of this extra bit of context that you got in this paragraph? Right? Again, with P6, adding that point about quitting and how quitting can exacerbate feelings of depression. And also, it becomes more difficult when you are depressed to begin with, that vicious cycle. Here, with relapsing, the fact that negative emotions can cause relapse, right? Or can be a trigger for relapse, which of course would send you right back down that vicious spiral again, right? These are things that are worth mentioning because although the main idea will get you most of the questions, you might have questions that are asking about points made in specific paragraphs. Okay. And especially when half the passage is all with the same idea, it's valuable to track because we don't want to lose half the passage in context. That being said, we definitely have our main idea, right? And it's this tie between smoking and emotional pain and depression. Um, Clearly, we've looked at it from every angle. In my eyes, assured that no question, that's our main idea. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I totally agree. Like I feel like we're saying that all throughout. I think, sometimes I can get like I personally am more comfortable with passages where like we'll see the main idea like kind of trickling like I guess we'll see it in paragraph 2, or we'll see it in, you know, paragraph 1 even, or in the beginning, and then maybe we have some other paragraphs about something else, and then we'll come back to it at the end. Sometimes I can get a little scared when like, for example, here, paragraph 1 was about how nicotine affects, the brain. Paragraph 2 was about rapid onset. Paragraph 3 was about the pleasure. And then it's like five, six, seven, eight, where like like this is so clearly your main idea. I think I'm getting more comfortable with that, but I personally really like when it's like a little bit more spread out, and I think that that can throw some people off. But I think it's very clear that that's our main idea here. Like we see how much it's emphasized. It makes up a majority of the passage. Um, but yeah, I think if you're listening to this and when I was first doing cars, I remember I used to always think to myself, is the first paragraph should be where the main idea is, and the last paragraph should be where the main idea is. Like the middle paragraphs can be about anything, but the first and the last, that's the intro and the conclusion. They have to be. But it's really not like that. Like it's not like a solid structure you're always going to see constantly on cars. It can be all at the end. It can be even all in the middle. It can be all in the beginning. It's whatever is repeated the most. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I'd say.
I feel like it's the way that we were all taught to write in like high school. Like
Yes, exactly. That's what it
intro,
is.
you get some background, and then the last sentence of your first paragraph is like your thesis. And then the conclusion, the last paragraph is supposed to be like an inversion of that. You start with the thesis and you go through your
Yeah.
main points, and like it's just the way that we were all trained. That said, one, these are sometimes taken from large texts, books, research journals, you name it. So you're only seeing a fraction of it, but also these are, professional works of fiction, or in this case, more like research analysis. Like they don't necessarily follow our same cadence from when we all learned
Yeah.
things in high school. But it's so funny because everyone says the same thing, and I thought the same thing. But yeah, I mean, every Cars passage is going to be different. And I think it's part of the fun part of Cars. I know we've mentioned it before, but it's almost like, every person that you meet in your day-to-day life or at work, everyone's going to have a slightly different personality, a slightly different way of explaining things, of perceiving the world. I think that's what Cars is it's giving you a million different perspectives, a million different ways of thinking, a million different ways of organizing information, right? And it's our job to figure out what makes this person tick. Like based on what I see of the way that they think, the evidence I have of that, what does this person believe? What are their key, you know, um, arguments that they believe in, right? And I think it makes you a good listener. I kind of like it when I feel it build. Um, but we all have different preferences. At the end of the day, though, we all have to be ready for anything. So focus on the things that we've talked about finding those core arguments. And again, just as a word to the wise, when you're looking for the main idea, it's not always the most general idea. And it's not always, it shouldn't be a feeling, right? At the end of this paragraph or at the end of this passage, my feeling is like, oh, smoking's bad, right? Smoking is serious. Smoking is not a good thing. That said, that was never really officially stated anywhere in this. That would be really
Yeah.
dangerous for me to come away from this passage and say that's the main idea because that was never said. Okay, what you should always do if you're looking for the main idea is look down and say which argument from the actual passage was mentioned the most. Okay, don't go with your brain and your gut, go with your eyes. That's one of the reasons we make a map. And in this paragraph or in this passage, paragraph 4 and the related ideas in 5, 6, 7, and 8, those have really controlled the whole message here. So, on that note, we have actually 7 questions for this passage. A lot of different opportunities to really test your understanding of the passage itself and of the reasoning required in CARS questions. So we encourage you to do those. If you do those questions and you want any clarification, check the solutions. You actually might see a familiar face explaining those questions to you and the passage if you want a quick recap, because Usher actually does our video solutions for our JW Plus subscribers. So if you see Usher in those questions, now you'll know he's here on the podcast as well. Usher, anything that we should look out for in these questions? Anything cool about them?
I actually thought that I think that when you have a passage like this, like just in general, like whenever I read a passage and it's like not one of those art or like history passages where the language is like the passage is written in like 1700 and and the language is really difficult to interpret, like I am personally always wary when I have a passage like this where I think the language isn't bad. Like it's not like necessarily you're I don't know, you're trying so hard to define every single sentence. I get wary of what's going to come in the questions. I feel like the questions are going to be difficult. So I don't want to spoil too much, but I did like the questions on here. There's 7 of them, so it's a longer one. But I think that there's some challenge in there, but I think as long as you tracked the ideas and you were tracking those names, you'll be able to hopefully um, pinpoint everything that you need to and answer the questions just fine. So
Awesome. Ooh, we got a little sneak peek. So everyone go check out the questions. Say hello virtually to Usher in those video solutions. And we hope that we hope that you join us in our next one. Thank you guys so much for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your morning or evening or afternoon, whenever we catch you. And before we see you next, happy studying. Hope to see you soon.